Well, welcome to the Westminster Standard. I'm Ryan Beasy, your host, and today I am joined by teaching elder David Cassidy. David, welcome. Thank you for appearing on the podcast. We're going to talk about item number 2, which our listeners or viewers may remember is Overture 23 from this past year. Before we do that, David, would you introduce yourself? Tell us how you came to the PCA and where you are now and where you've been.
Yeah. Ryan, thanks so much for having me on today. It's a great privilege and
Honor to have you.
glad to join you and the others who are listening in. Um, I'm at Spanish River Church in Boca Raton, Florida, where I serve as the senior pastor here. And I came into the PCA in 2000, so about 23 years ago. I grew up in the Lutheran Church, led charismatic churches for a long number of years, both in the UK and in the US. I moved to England when I was 19 and lived there for 10 years. While I was there, I met Francis Schaefer, who, that's another whole long story, kind of kicked my tail and sent me on a long, I'm a slow learner, so long, reading trajectory towards returning to a more reformational heritage. And eventually that meant moving my ordination from independence to the PCA. And that happened through a couple of years of interacting with good people like Scotty Smith and my friend Dr. David Filson and Kevin Twitt and others who were in the Nashville Presbytery at the time. I was driving down there from Western Kentucky, and I had a lot of friends in Nashville and family too. And so it's kind of a case of hanging around the creek bank and falling in. And they were very kind and generous with me. And so that was my first encounter with the PCA. I didn't grow up around any Reformed people and didn't really know anything about some of the history of the various Presbyterian denominations, but eventually came to call this home. And then after a few years, moved to Austin, Texas, where I was the pastor of Redeemer Presbyterian in Austin, following Paul Hahn, who had planted that church there. Wonderful, wonderful congregation. And I served there, and then moved up to Christ Community Church in Franklin, following Scotty Smith, ironically, Scotty, my dear friend. And so they'd gone a couple of years without a pastor. Tony Giles was serving as interim, did a wonderful job for them there. Then I followed on. And, our heart for global mission, for Tony and I, my wife, that's always been a big deal for us. And so when we were asked by Spanish River to consider coming here, given the much more cosmopolitan area in which this congregation is located and its legacy of planting churches, not only in the U.S., but globally, and training the next generation of leaders for that was something which was a really compelling call. So we find ourselves here and very grateful to be here and serving this congregation. Great sense of revitalization and renewal here now. We just lost our long-serving executive pastor, Ron Tobias, passed away a few weeks ago. We had the memorial service for him this last weekend, and I think it's safe to say that Ron's leadership, along with David Nicholas and Tommy Kiedis, who succeeded him, really was, established a remarkable, humble, fruitful pathway for church planting that really changed so many approaches for many, many years. So we're happy to continue that work, and we pray that God continues to bless it, and I hope other people will pray for us too.
Mm-hmm, indeed. I think Aldo Leon was one of the church planters that the Spanish River Church had supported, and
That's right.
he's a friend of mine. We're thankful for his ministry. I'm sure there are others, but his is the name that comes first to mind. A very fruitful ministry there in Miami that y'all have been a part of and supporting. So thank you for the work of the church and your ministry. So you have a Lutheran background as well?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Was it the good guys or was it the ELCA?
Well, you know what? I was LCA when I was small.
Okay. Yeah.
But I think again, these labels tend to float a bit. So I was, I was baptized at Trinity Lutheran Church in a little town in northern Illinois. It's safe to say that they were a very evangelical congregation. My parents moved to north central Indiana, and they helped to plant a church there. So I've kind of been in church planting since I was a kid. Mom playing the piano, and Dad was the treasurer and all that. So we were tithing tooth fairy money. It was I had a very conservative
Yeah.
evangelical pastor, Kermit Youngdale. He'd been a missionary in Kenya for, oh gosh, I think 17 years or something, and then he helped plant this church. So while LCA, as it was known then, not even ELCA, was
Right. Right.
drifting that direction, I was a kid and really wasn't conscious
Yeah.
of any of that stuff. In my
No. No.
mid-teens, when I was 16 or so, my parents switched to the Missouri Synod because
Yeah.
Youngdale moved away, and
Mm.
they sent in a guy who was very, very liberal.
Yeah.
That was it for Dad and Mom. They moved to the Missouri Synod at that point. But really, by that time, I, at the zenith of my wisdom, at 16 or 17, had had ditched what I considered to be
mm.
a sort of dead formalistic
Mm.
kind of Christianity that I associated with the Reformation and things more ancient. In search of the radicals. I wanted to
Yeah.
go find the radicals. Those were my people. So I really wasn't all that interested at that point anyway. And I begrudgingly attended church with them on Sundays and made life very difficult for my parents. My rebellion, I wasn't out doing drugs. I was out doing Pentecostalism.
That'll do it. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's remarkable the number of folks who have come from the ELCA, not the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, but the ELCA, which is
Oh
my
yeah.
background as well,
Yeah.
into the PCA. We were just in St. Louis, my family and I, and we drove past right on Interstate 55, the site of the church where I was
Oh
baptized, and
wow.
it's a quick trip gas station now,
How about that?
which
My
is
goodness. Well, I
when
still break out my old red hymnal
yeah, yeah.
from LC. I think that particular liturgy is one of the finest ever
Yes.
composed in the English language. It's just brilliant,
It's
and I'm
it's a
very
great
grateful.
it's
Yeah.
a great liturgy, and it's my parents are Missouri Synod now
So I
as
was
well.
grateful to be baptized, catechized, confirmed there, and learned so much. I'm very
Yeah,
thankful for my heritage.
it's a great foundation, and yes. But let's so you are at Spanish River, which is as you said, a very cosmopolitan area there on the coast. In this excellent article, I'm going to try to bring it up if I can figure out how to use the technology here that you wrote for the Presbyterian Polity site.
Mhm.
Um, I think you got a little bit of heat on the Twitter unnecessarily for this because you go back to the roots of really our current cultural milieu, which is Roman paganism.
Right, right.
So what are the ways that you see the church being called to minister in a society with a very similar context to the church, the apostolic church?
Well, uh, there are intersections between what's happening in contemporary Western society and Greco-Roman society. There are intersections. It's not parallel.
Sure,
So there are
sure.
places where there's crossover. What I think Western society is undergoing right now is a radical shift that is, in some ways, especially in regard to sexuality and other moral dynamics, unprecedented. In that, the completely secularized vision of this, a society built without gods,
Mm,
so to speak, an overarching moral theory is being advanced. And so that every person becomes a law unto themselves. Um, every person doing that which is right in their own eyes, in other words.
the
So
days.
this approach within our society is leading to a kind of moral chaos, and it's accelerating in its pace. And that, of course, is disorientating. It's frightening for many people. And understandably so. And so, if we think about the pace of change within the courts of the United States, office holders in in the civil government, and the way in which the church has tried to respond to that, but in fact, the way the church, broadly considered, in some ways pioneered that change with
Mm,
Eugene Robinson
mm,
and his his ministry. That again reminds us that even though that might have been the Episcopal Church was a small denomination, but certainly punches above its weight historically and societally. Um, that began in some ways to carve out a place within our culture for a wider permissiveness on certain issues. So there's a whole host of layers to the conversation that take place with regard to sexual ethics, of course. But what we see happening right now is a society attempting to construct norms without any reference to revelation.
Mm.
And of course, that leads to a kind of anarchy. But anarchy cannot exist for long.
No.
It is simply destructive. So it will inevitably produce some new tyranny. But the important thing for the church to do, I think, in this is to have clear convictions of our own that we take from Revelation, not that we've invented, and that we very aware of our own sinfulness, our own brokenness, our own need for continuous repentance and crying out to God for mercy. Look to grow in sanctification and holiness, the way the scriptures instruct us, and to reach out in mercy for all those who are both broken by the current sexual revolution and even those who cause the breakage. There will be those whom God calls to himself in both of those contexts. And the clarity of the gospel is humbly, joyfully, lovingly presented will open doors for those God's calling to do that. So faithful presentation of the gospel, faithfulness in our own conduct, compassion towards all those who don't yet know Jesus, compassionate convictions, clarity and charity. That's got to be the posture of our heart, and we can't let go of either the convictions or the necessity of going into the world with its complete confusion and bringing the love of Christ through the gospel.
And we've been wrestling with that as a denomination in the PCA for a number of years of how to do that, what that looks like. There's been pushback that as we try to clarify our standards of ordination for our current cultural crisis. I don't think it's an overstatement to call it a crisis in the sense this is a turning point in the culture. How do we do that? And so we've had a number of attempts as a denomination. We had some good consensus last year, I think, at General Assembly on a number of overtures. But of course, we've been trying to do that since really I think 2019 when we added 2018 in the at the Atlanta Assembly when we added that one sentence to our Book of Church Order codifying our definition of marriage, and then in 2021 at the St. Louis Assembly, there was some language that was approved by the Assembly, but not ratified by the presbyteries.
And I think 2019 in Dallas that what the Nashville statement was.
That's right. That's
commended.
Right.
Yeah.
Commended as biblically faithful, which has no constitutional standing, but of course
That's right.
is pious advice and helpful advice.
It's what you're right in noting is that for several years now there have been really intentional work. There's intentional work that's been done to try to keep this before the brothers at the assembly and to try to find ways to help the church navigate these waters. So
yes, and as we interact with one another, not in a Hegelian dialectic, but nonetheless, iron does sharpen iron, and we can come up with better statements than just one group of men or a small group of men working with guys who all share their own context and ideas. But the final what we've come up with is I think one sentence that's been added in two places to our Book of Church Order for elder and deacon. I've got it here on the screen, and maybe I can even make it a little bit bigger for the two people that will actually watch this. We'll probably have more people who will listen to it, but for our YouTube viewers, he should conform to the biblical requirement of chastity and sexual purity in his descriptions of himself and in his convictions, character, and conduct. So some good alliteration there from the brothers in the Presbytery of Mississippi Valley. So that's, I think, was it 88% of the assembly voted to send that on to the presbyteries. Tell me why you supported it. I know some young short guy called the question before you could make it to the mic, but
he did. Yes, he did. He felt led to do that. That's okay. His privilege It's his privilege to do so. That's right.
He makes a habit of that.
Yeah, well, yeah. Um, we were discussing earlier whether that's your spiritual gift. So we'll um, I think the work that was done on this, and I know my colleague David Strain had a big hand in this, was looking for the kind of language which covers the bases and and on the whole spectrum of sexual holiness, as well as the language we use and employ to talk about how we are identified in Christ and do that in a way that allows no lack of clarity in regard to those matters. So I think he did a great job on that, and I think this accomplishes those things. And because it doesn't single out one sin in particular, but covers everything, and I think that's reflective of the way the standards work. Um, that it will name things, but it so there's a comprehensive aspect to it, and that's reflected in this kind of summary language, which I think we want in the BCO. It it does what we need the BCO to do, and I don't know that it will absolutely end debate on these things. I don't know that that's the case, but I'm optimistic that it will achieve not just the acceptance, a wide acceptance in the various presbyteries, but serve as a way to unify us on the issue. I think it reflects the ethos and the language of the AIC study committee report. And I think it reflects, therefore, the unity of the PCA as a whole on this issue. We've struggled over the language to try to communicate. And it's really not surprising given the way that language has been in a state of flux over these issues for some years. So it's really not surprising that we struggle with language.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the struggle over language made some people think that there was really some kind of widespread division on the ethics. And I don't think that's, or on the theology, and I don't think that's the case at all. That's why the study committee reports received such a almost near unanimous assent as well. So
Yes.
I think this reflects our unity. I think it gives us what we need in a document like the BCO that we can all subscribe to, and will help presbyteries work with officer candidates to discern where they're at in maturity and growth in grace and sanctification, so that they're able to serve.
Yeah, I think when this debate began, in earnest at least in the PCA,
Mm-hmm.
and we received some overtures in 2021, very specific. I've got the one from 2021, Overture 23, the old Overture 23.
Yeah.
Some very explicit gay Christian, same-sex attracted Christian,
Right.
homosexual Christian, or like terms. The wider issue of transvestitism hadn't really come to the fore as much as it has now, and so I think that you're right. The idea of chastity, and chastity being different than celibacy, chastity being more all-encompassing. I know
Right.
that was, and maybe we'll talk about that later. That was a concern that some had, that you can be celibate and still not chaste.
Right.
And we want chastity inside, outside of marriage, before and after marriage.
That's right.
And so this is much more comprehensive than even, I think I've got it there, Overture 15, which was just squeaked by, I think, by 52% last year in Birmingham. Again, singling out homosexual, which I think it was pointed out in years past. And full disclosure, I voted for this, and I called the question on it too in Birmingham. Dove in front of teaching elder Nick Bullock to get to the mic to call the question on there. But again, that's a very specific issue, and note, whereas the work of the brothers in Mississippi Valley who gave this as a gift to the church, I think,
Yeah.
the requirement of chastity, character, convictions, and conduct. Um, how does this build upon then our Westminster standards? The duties of the larger catechism and the seventh commandment. It uses the language, doesn't it? Chastity in body, mind,
Well,
affections, words,
yep,
behavior,
yep,
temperance, chaste company, and I think
yep.
that's one of the. How do you see this as even needed? I could see someone pushing back and saying, as we've seen before, this is unnecessary because we have the larger catechism. So, would you talk about why this is unnecessary? I think that was even the title of your article. We need
We
Overture
need it.
23.
Well, I think we need it in a couple of ways. I mean, first of all, in certain ways, the BCO is derivative from the standards. It's uh, it's meant to reflect the standards and say, here's how we're going to go about our work based on the theology that we hold, that we regard as a summary of the faith. So polity arises from that. So I would contend that there's no lack of clarity in the standards, right? I don't think it's needed in the sense that somehow the standards were unclear. But there's a couple of other things that are um, involved. First of all, the use of language, particularly in regard to human sexuality, has shifted a great deal, especially since the 19th century, in the English speaking world and then more globally. So the way in which we hear things and read things always needs careful attention. Uh, we know we've already talked about how difficult it is for us to have conversations about these things to find the right language. Something like the word gay or same-sex attracted or whatever. Everybody knows that these are loaded terms. They come with all kinds of implications and tentacles that go out to all kinds of situations. So it's very difficult to find the right language to use at times, whether we're having a theological discussion or say an evangelistic discussion with someone. All of it is fraught with peril. So we have to give careful attention to language. So simply assuming that a mid 17th century document is going to be completely adequate for how we need to do things is probably assuming too much, asking too much of that document. But rooted in that document, rising from it, can be language which we employ now to help us apply that truth within our particular ecclesiastical context and to our own souls, to our own piety, and our own ministries, our preaching. Um, Not to mention discipline or training leaders for the future. So all of that's good and necessary. But the other issue of necessity, I think, is the potential, at least, to unify the PCA so that we have clarity, a clear uh, language. We have clear language in a couple of places here in our BCO, both for elders and for deacons, so that we can move forward together. I think there's now. Um, I value all of this debate over the last several years. I think one of the myths is that truth is easily um, arrived at in the church when it comes to doctrinal statements. Historically, that's not always been the case, and or that it's easily held to. That's certainly not always been the case. Whether even if we're talking about something like Chalcedonian or Nicene orthodoxy, for a long time after those things were settled, there were still Arians who were, you know, in positions of leadership in the church and carrying ministry on and so on. So the idea that we just easily get this all done in a matter of a few years or a few weeks or something like that is, I know, something that the modern age, late modern age wants. As I said, we stand in front of microwaves with our feet yelling, "Hurry!"
Hurry
That's
up! Yeah.
right. That's the way we are. I get impatient at traffic lights because when I can go 80 miles an hour. So the our impatience with these things is telling. So I don't despise any of the process, and there may be more process that's yet necessary, but I do think this has the potential, at least, to bring us to substantial unity and put some things into practice um, for the next several years. And I think that helps us. I think it's needed in the PCA so that we can move forward together on other matters. Um, Planning churches, getting on with the mission, helping RUF, whatever you want to talk about. I mean, there's so many good things
Yeah.
that God's doing through the work of the gospel. I don't say that in any way to diminish this debate. It's an important and necessary debate. I'm simply saying that once we've resolved it, I think we can give more energy, more passion, more attention to then the other matters. And I'm hopeful on that score.
Indeed, indeed.
I might be naive, but I think that's the case.
Yeah, I think that this has consumed a lot of energy and
Yeah,
sucked a lot of the oxygen out of the room.
sure.
And in many ways, we had a scandal in our own denomination, which led, I think, to this being such a hot button issue. Um, Fred Greco has a number of aphorisms, but one of them is you can take exception to the Westminster Standards, but you can't take exception to the Book of Church Order, or something similar to that. Do you think that is one of the reasons we need to have this in our Book of Church Order, because you can't differ from it? It is how you it's how you have to operate.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we can amend the Book of Church Order as we're doing with this process,
Yes, yes.
right? I mean, so that's fine. A person can differ with it in that sense of saying, well, I think it could be better, or I think we've made a mistake here, or something like that. But I can't stand up and in substance take an exception to something that's in the BCO and find that that's
It's
gonna.
our operating procedures manual that if you
So
if you
yeah,
don't follow it, you're
right,
out
right.
eventually.
Well, Fred's gonna come after me. So there you go. But yeah,
Hopefully
I
not
think
after you.
what we want to do, we shouldn't take the approach that it's, you know, unamendable or something that,
No, absolutely not.
but we're simply saying we've agreed to work by these things for now, and we're not going to take exceptions to that. If it needs to be changed, we'll go to work on it. And what we do is we go to work on it together, and it's not easy to change.
And nor should it be, in
Correct.
my view at least.
That's exactly right. It's not easy to alter. We do need to get to 2/3
Yes,
of the
yeah.
presbyteries, and then it has to be, it has to get a second reading and a second vote. I think all of that's something very beautiful in our polity.
Yeah, we don't, and I think this Overture 23, which is actually, now it's item 2,
Right.
is superior to a number of the overtures that were considered and items that were considered in previous years because of its comprehensiveness, its simplicity, its clarity.
Yeah.
But I do wonder, and this is probably a topic for another episode, but when you and David Strain were discussing subscription and the idea that you can express and practice a difference with our Westminster Standards, but not the Book of Church Order. So we do need to have there's greater emphasis on having a parallel constitutional documents, because now I don't think any presbytery would approve a difference with Larger Catechism 138.
No.
But nonetheless, when it comes down to legal matters and the civil magistrate, having a part of your constitution that is not written in stone, but from which deviations cannot be tolerated, I think is helpful and needful, given our stance on subscription.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's helpful.
And well, let me. One of the things that you wrote back in, I think it was March of 2022, which I thought was took a lot of integrity to say, was let's see, that there were guys in your quarter of our church who were a little bit soft on, or maybe not soft, but didn't speak out against the revoice situation as quickly as they should have, or hadn't been as outspoken as they should have. And I when I read that, I just said that took a lot of integrity, a lot of sincerity to say. Has your position changed on those matters as we've seen things develop?
I don't. Well, first of all, when I made that remark, I'm talking about myself. I don't think I should lay that at anybody else's feet. Right?
Sure.
I think there were a couple of moments when I might have said something, and in particular, that would have been regard to the Sessions actions at Memorial, which which did, in measure at least, end up being addressed by the Missouri Presbytery.
Yeah.
But so I would at least say that. I think we're all shaped by a whole variety of experiences on this matter. So for myself, and this would go all the way back to my um, college days, and then certainly in every church I've ever pastored, I knew Christians and those who were not Christians who were treated in appalling manners because they struggled with same-sex attraction, and they were castigated. They were subjected to all manner of verbal abuse. Wow, some of those stories are almost too painful to get into.
Mm.
So I saw a lot of that. And I also, pastored people in every church I've ever served, whether it was in London or Kentucky, Tennessee, Texas, here, who struggle with these issues. And of course, one of the things that they struggle with is a great sense of shame, fear, and so on. So, um, having been probably in early days more shaped by Schaefer and Stott, okay, than say more contemporary or current voices, my predisposition was towards how do we care for people who are looking to follow Christ and serve Him, and how do we help them towards sanctification? How do we help them grow in grace? And that's been my starting place. So I think there's a lot of people who come from that starting place, particularly those who are shepherding people in these areas, and whether those were in large metropolitan areas or elsewhere. But the need for um, speaking about, uh, in my view, sinful or inappropriate uses of church facilities, things like that, unwise, uh, should have been part of the discussion. What I do know happened is that, and this is I'm just speaking for myself, right?
Sure.
Okay,
Yeah. Yeah.
is that in my view, I kept running into very angry people. Now I understand their anger. I'm going to try to, if I try to put myself over in their sandals, I'm going to say, okay, help me understand your anger. Help me understand. But what I kept hearing were these angry voices, unsympathetic voices, and they sounded very, very similar to me to some of the voices that I'd heard across the years that
Mm.
weren't looking to help people find their way forward in Jesus through the power of the gospel. They have a very defensive posture, and I didn't fully understand or appreciate um, maybe their background, where they were coming from. I thought Kevin made an interesting comment. Kevin DeYoung made an interesting comment in his review of Colin Hansen's book on Keller, where he noted the different backgrounds that they had, and Kevin coming from an experience where he was seeing a church that he was part of as a minister moving towards liberalism and his constant conflict there. So again, we all have these different backgrounds, and they shape the way in which we respond to certain things. Those aren't excuses. I just think they're part of the foundation of why we respond in certain
They're
ways.
relevant. They're absolutely
Yeah, that's
relevant.
so I'm filtering everything through some really difficult um, voices that I've heard in the past, and I'm hearing a lot of anger. I'm hearing a lot of uh, merciless language from certain people, and that made me very reluctant to sound as if I were going to be singing in that choir.
Mm.
Does that make sense?
Oh yes. You know.
So I'm not saying, and I should have said something within the context of what I was saying, but I did have a certain reluctance because of that.
Yeah, it's hard to you don't want to pile on, and you don't want to be misunderstood.
Tacit consent,
Yeah.
silence leading to the view that I agree with something is also not excusable.
Right.
So
Right.
I just think I should have salted that in, and and that was a failure on my part.
And I think you've got a good word there for guys on in a different quarter of the PCA who, you know, didn't respond as patiently as we ought to have. That the concerns were legitimate over some of the actions going on in Missouri Presbytery, um, but it doesn't help to pour gasoline on a fire.
No, and we have to have a fundamental trust in one another and in the work of our presbyteries and committees and so on. And I think that's how we get our best work done.
Yeah, yeah,
That's
and
where
I
we
think
that's the starting place.
yes, and I think this Overture 23, item 2, as it will be before our presbyteries. I think there's only one presbytery that's voted. I think it's Ascension has voted already.
Hmm.
Maybe by the time this comes out next week, we'll have another presbytery or two. It's presbytery meeting week, I think.
Scott will definitely keep us. Scott Eber will make sure that we do know
Yes, that's
what's going on.
yeah. He's a good brother.
Yes.
So, what are some of your aspirations for the PCA as we look forward? Hopefully, united in our view of chastity and human sexuality. Where would you like to see the PCA in 10 years? We've been looking back over the last 50.
Yeah. I'm excited about the next 50. You know, I'm obviously not going to be around for all of that, but hey, you might. So I hope to be around for the next 20, and hang out for that. But I think that we again live in an age of gospel opportunity. Uh, I think there's a lot of hand wringing that goes on because everybody gets caught up in culture warrior stuff
Mm,
and everything about North America. Now I understand you got to take care of home base and we have to bear witness where we are, but um, the work of what God's doing across the world uh, is extraordinary.
mm,
And new churches being planted, great gospel movements that are seeing thousands of people come to Christ. Uh, I'm I think we have a tremendous opportunity ahead of us to see more churches planted, to see really powerful witness for the gospel going on at university campuses through RUF. Not to, I mean, just to talk about just the PCA,
PCA.
and yeah, but what we do on church planting, what we do on seminaries, all of that's going to be very challenging. You look around at seminaries, RTS is experiencing a lot of, a lot of enrollment. Uh, Greenville's experiencing that. Covenant seeing an uptick. All of that's positive, and we should we're going to have to work really, really hard over the next several years to encourage the next generation of pastors, church planners, missionaries, um, all of the folks going into these areas of ministries across not only the U.S. but all over the world. So um, I think it's a great gospel opportunity for us over the next several years. I'm not wringing my hands one bit. I look around. We have simultaneous Spanish and Portuguese language translation going on in our services. We've got a Haitian congregation that uses one of our buildings. A Spanish language congregation uses one of our buildings. We may have to add Russian language. There's just tons of opportunity out here. There are people who don't know the gospel, don't know who Christ is, and I think we've got to focus our attention on I don't want to say a new apologetic, um, but what I would say is uh, um, making sure that our gospel presentation is answering the questions people are asking and helping them to then ask the right questions rather than looking for them to answer questions that they don't have any reference points for.
Right.
So the dots have moved, and the amount of time it takes to plant churches now is a lot longer. The culture is not as biblically and scripturally informed. There's not as I mentioned at the outset, a kind of unified field of vision about even a word like God, what that means, or who Christ is, or something like that. That's all shifted radically in the last 40, 50 years. So how we approach things is going to demand from us creativity to go with our fidelity.
Mm.
And I'm encouraged. I see a lot of young pastors coming up who are going to get on with it, and I'm hopeful.
Yeah, yeah. I'm profoundly optimistic, which I think our theology is optimistic. The theology of the Westminster Standards
Mm.
requires an optimism,
Yeah.
and if people sometimes in the church I serve will get discouraged, or people that I know in the PCA, well, look at the trends, look at the Ligonier state of theology on this country. Well, that's one thing, but look at Africa. Look at look at Korea. Look at
I mean,
China.
it's just off the charts. It's
Yeah.
tremendous. But even where somebody wants to moan about a lack, I would say it's the old story of the two guys who were sent to sell shoes somewhere. They went someplace, and the guy said, "Just bring me on home. Nobody here wears shoes." And the other guy said, "Send more shoes. Nobody here has any."
That's
So,
right.
you
Yeah.
know, I mean, we're wherever we live, we're going to have tremendous opportunities to share Christ, teach the gospel, get people rooted in good theology. All of them, gosh, it's just endless. I get up every day completely fired up and excited over what's in front of us. Can't
Mm.
wait. I can't wait to get
Yeah.
after it.
Yeah. And
Now
we
the
have.
PCA, I worry about the PCA always having fights, Ryan. I mean, I do. I got to tell you, I wish we'd stop that stuff. I wish we'd stop having a food fight. And I having been a guy who was, in an independent situation
Mm.
for many, many years, and I felt like when I joined the PCA, I moved into this, room full of people like, uh, RC and Schaefer and all these guys that I had as heroes, influenced by others like John Murray and many, many more. And I felt like I moved into this mansion. I'd been living under a bridge, and then everybody in the mansion's having a food fight,
That's it.
throwing
You know,
stuff. I'm like, y'all, you have no idea
you
how
don't know
great
what
you
you've
are.
got.
You all need to
Yeah.
calm down.
Yeah,
What's wrong
and
with
when I was in Mississippi, we had a man who was between pastors. He was a Baptist, but
you? Mhm.
Calvinistic in his theology, and he just said, "Man, I so envy you being in the PCA because he's getting called names for just believing in the sovereignty of God, just being a 5 point Calvinist." And,
Yeah.
I'm thinking, well, there is a solution to that. Just
Yeah.
just come on, but we in many ways we have the privilege of
Yeah.
fighting over
Yeah.
uh, more arcane issues because so much is settled.
There's so
There's
much wide agreement, and that's a great point. So, uh, I think we should, really have a posture of kindness, warmth,
mm,
generosity towards each other. Um, I've got so much to learn. I, I I show up every single GA wondering what I'm going to learn that year, unexpectedly, and
mm,
that's back to the debate issue. Like, uh, why do we want debates to go on for some time? Well, protecting minority opinions, but also, gosh, I just learned stuff.
yeah, yeah,
So, somebody will say something, and go, man, I never thought of it that way. Thank you for that. So, um, I think we have so much to learn from each other, and I'm very grateful for that.
yeah. The overture, the debate on atheists testifying in church courts. I was on one side of that, and after I think it was Howie Donahoe's speech, I leaned over to my ruling elder and I said, that was a good speech. He made some good point. I didn't agree with some of the things. And then there were a couple of others, on guys I didn't agree with, but those were good points. Those are things that we need
Yeah.
uh, to consider. Um, and James Bruce again made some good counterpoints on the other side, but that was for the most part good debate. Now there's always going to be some emotion. There's always going to be some
Yeah.
um, just anecdotal. This is my experience, but
Right.
that was the PCA at her best there in that debate, I think, and um, I'm hopeful we'll see some another way forward to address some of the concerns that were raised there.
They're
Uh,
important concerns. We don't want to give any quarter to abuse.
mm-mm.
We don't want to give any quarter to injustice. We don't want to give any quarter to falsehood.
No,
In
no.
courts, I've been a moderator in an ecclesiastical trial, and it's very difficult. And those who serve in those situations need all the evidence that they can get in order to conduct the business that's rightfully before them. So it's a hard issue, and I hope we can have those conversations going forward and figure out the best approach. I hope so.
Yes, yes. And in the PCA, we have a good foundation in our Westminster standards. I think that's even reflected going back to this Overture 23 with some of the same language from our larger catechism finds its way. And in our society, people understand chastity. They at least know what that means. To be chaste is a virtue, even in this society that's coming off the hinges in sexuality.
Yeah. We do have a society that's inventing a new set of virtues, self-expression, self-fulfillment, as opposed to self-sacrifice would be
Mm,
one example of that.
yeah.
But I do think, of course, and we know this, because people suppress the truth and unrighteousness. We know that down at the core of who they are as human beings, there is not just the awareness of, but the desire for
Yeah.
virtue to be seen. And when it is seen, it is something which immediately is bearing witness to the love and the kindness and the holiness of God. So we do want those things in our lives.
Amen. Amen. And I think our Westminster Standards, somebody said recently on a podcast that the Westminster Standards are our context for ministry. And I think that's one of the things we see throughout the world that, as the Reformed Church, even in the People's Republic of China, is growing. And it's hard to get reliable statistics, but someone said there are 200 million Christians in China.
Mm-hmm.
And a huge proportion of those are Reformed and Presbyterian. Pastor Wang Yi still in prison, a Presbyterian
Yes.
pastor.
Yes.
And the witness of the Reformed Church is widely respected and throughout China because of our clarity, because of the work done by those men over the centuries to refine and reform and clearly state our theology. So we have a gift, and I appreciate the men in Mississippi Valley providing this overture, using the language of our larger catechism to help us minister in our current context. Well, anything else as we close, David? Thank you so much for your time this morning.
It was a pleasure, Ryan. Thanks so much for having me along today, and pray God's blessing on you and your work.
Thanks for listening in to the conversation on the Westminster Standard podcast, which is brought to you by Jude 3. Please visit our website, jude3pca.org, and join us again next week as we hear from ruling elder James Elkin, better known as Bebo Elkin. Bebo is one of the founding fathers of Reformed University Ministries and later RUF. We'll talk to you then.